had been here since the Ottomans arrived. It was the sparkling jewel of Turkish architecture, the Topkapi Palace. Istanbul was the capital of the bustling, powerful and rich Ottoman Empire. From it, power radiated like the spokes of a wheel. And at its hub was the Topkapi Palace, which for 400 years was the home of the royal court and the political center of the empire. It is essentially a series of 4 courts, each being more exclusive than the preceding one. The first court is guarded by the Bab-e-Humayun, upon which the heads of traitors were displayed as a warning to others. The first court was functional, flanked by a hospital, bakery, mint, armory, and accommodation for palace servants. But at its end stands the Gate of Greeting. Through it is the second court and the council chamber. Here the Sultan and his ministers would meet to conduct their business.
In the 16th century it became the practice for the Sultan not to attend the Imperial Council, but he had to be seen to keep an eye on it. So there's a grill in the wall, high up on the wall behind the council benches, and that was covered with a window. So if the Sultan wanted to, he could go there and watch the council at work, but if he didn't fancy it, then they couldn't tell he wasn't there.
Later, in an adjoining and more lavishly decorated room, the Sultan would question his ministers on what business had been discussed. Not knowing if they'd been overheard or not, the ministers were obliged to tell the truth. The Bab-e-Sadat, or the Gate of Felicity, leads to the third and more private court. The Sultan alone was allowed to ride through this gate on horseback. Those few mere mortals whom the eunuch guards allowed to pass had to do so on foot. But enough feet have trodden this path over the centuries to leave a distinct impression in the marble floor. Many of those feet were making their way to the Chamber of Petitions. Here the Sultan would receive ambassadors.
If you were an ambassador, you were taken through really under pretty large guard, and you were presented to the Sultan, who sat in this chamber, which is a sort of pavilion standing on its own, very, very grand, surrounded by an arcade. And the Sultan would sit on his throne in the corner in total silence and fail to notice you. And the French ambassador or the Dutch ambassador or whoever, or the Iranian ambassador, would be brought in and would be shown the Sultan, and he would present things to the Sultan, but the Sultan generally didn't deign to notice that anyone had come to see him.
The Topkapi Palace wasn't just a seat of power, it was a seat of learning too. One of its many functions was as a sort of university for the next generation of Ottoman governors. Promising students were recruited from across the empire, turning the bustling palace into an international melting pot. But a quirk of fate was to change the ordered administrative function of the Topkapi Palace.
In the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, there was a fire in the old palace, which is the first palace of the sultans in Istanbul, and that's where the women lived. And so Suleiman's wife, Hürrem Sultan, actually decided she'd go and live with him in the palace. And so to the left of this courtyard is where harem buildings were inserted into the ground plan, although there wasn't really room for them.
The harem's very existence might escape the casual visitor, were its presence not given away by the looming Tower of Justice at its center. This was a sort of lookout post from which the Sultan could observe his palace and city without the bother of having to leave the harem. The harem was originally built by Sinan in the late 16th century. It became the principal quarters of the royal family, sultans, mothers, wives, concubines, everyone. The guards were eunuchs. Sinan had become chief architect in 1538. He was responsible for the ceramics workshops as well as building. And under his influence, there was a transformation in the way tile work was used. It became an integral feature of Ottoman architecture. Shapes and sizes were standardized and a sort of mass production started. Tiles covered the walls like tapestries and textiles. No section of the royal quarters proclaimed the Sultan's wealth and liking for luxury better than the 16th century bath complex. Marble and gold abound. Part of the harem acted as a prison for the Sultan's younger brothers, albeit a luxurious prison. In early Turkish and Mongol tradition, a dead leader's lands and wealth were divided up among his sons. Dividing an empire would only leave weak individual parts. So the radical solution of killing the younger sons was employed.
This was a practical solution, but this was applied only for 2 centuries, and then it turned into a more continental style. The other male members were not killed, but they were kept in what we called kafes or cage in the palace until they die.
The young princes were locked up here in luxury with guards and concubines of their own. They just stayed there for years, and many were found to be quite mad by the time they were let out, if ever they were. Turkish annals are full of stories about paranoid princes sanctioning mass murder if they ever became sultan themselves. In the 17th century, one such prince was Ibrahim the Mad. He was released from the cage after 22 years and seated on the throne. He is said to have been a regular bather and reveler in the pool at the center of the fourth court. On his emergence from the cage, he promptly drowned 280 of his concubines after rumors of harem plotting. Next to the pool, Ibrahim the Mad built a small but exquisite feature, a golden loggia, from where he could gaze down on the center of his empire.
One of the most monumental parts of the palace complex, a loggia that overlooks the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, offering views of whatever was sort of beneath the eyes of the Sultan, whatever was visible in the geography that he controlled, in the geography that the Ottoman Empire controlled.
But Ibrahim had a much more practical use for the loggia during the fasting month of Ramadan.
During the month of Ramadan, you're not allowed to eat as a Muslim in the hours of daylight. The idea is the Sultan sat on there, and because he had a good view of where the sun set, he could start his meal as soon as the sun had set in the west. And this little balcony gives a fantastic view over the Golden Horn.
Ibrahim also built the circumcision room, covered inside and out with 16th and 17th century Iznik tiles. This was the heyday of tile making in Iznik, a town about 60 kilometers southeast of Istanbul. The early Iznik tiles were mainly blue and white, although a few other colors, such as red, were added to the palette later on. Just before that, more Iznik tiles were employed in the fourth court when the Baghdad pavilion was built to celebrate the Ottomans' taking of that city in 1638. Other Istanbul buildings are also famed for the quality of their tiles. One is another of Sinan's masterpieces, the small Rustam Pasha Mosque. It was commissioned in 1561 to commemorate an Ottoman general who had been born in Bosnia and eventually married Suleiman's daughter.